Oh, this is the narrated PowerPoint for Understanding Crime module. We're on to lecture number 8 now. I'm going to explore Hershey's control theory. Not just Hershey, there are other people who've argued around control theory. And from there we'll get on to some of the issues around right realism and left realism in the study of crime, which is essentially how people more on the political right wing and people more on the political left wing view criminal issues and recommend policies and so forth accordingly. We'll begin with Travis Hershey himself, who's only been dead a few years, as you can see there, which is unusual for us in that most of the people we've studied so far have been dead for a very long time. Sporadically we do someone who's still alive or only recently departed. American sociologist who proposed various ideas, quite a lot of ideas, including things around control theory, which is mostly what we'll focus on today, and the relationship of IQ and social class to crime, in that his general arguments there tend to be that people of lower IQs are more likely to commit crime, although if you are maybe slightly more cynical, you might argue perhaps it's people of lower IQ who are more likely to get caught committing crime, and perhaps those criminals who have a somewhat higher IQ maybe are sufficiently clever to get away with it, and so don't tend to get caught and appear in statistics. IQ here relates to social class, and the usual perception that the lower someone's social class is, the lower their IQ tends to be. Now, this is not a reflection of their sort of native intelligence or their innate intelligence. It's meant to be more a simple, straightforward reflection that people from poorer areas of society don't tend to have the expensive educations that people from better off sections of society have. And therefore the less education you receive, the less well you'll do on things like IQ tests. So you could be very bright in all sorts of ways, but if you've not been through the style of formal education offered in this country by, let's say, Eton or Harrow, then are you likely to perform well at IQ tests and understand the kinds of questions you get posed in IQ tests? Probably not. So it's not saying that poor people are less intelligent so much as simply less well educated and therefore less likely to do well on things like IQ. And by extension, perhaps less likely to make sensible decisions about various issues, and there have been a number of studies done on this, including people in seasonal work, where patterns can often show that when someone is earning well in their seasonal job, they make long-term, thoughtful, considered plans. They come across as therefore making more intelligent decisions. When their seasonal work is out of season, and so they're earning very little or maybe even nothing whatsoever, then they tend to make more impulsive decisions, less considered, somewhat more short-sighted, unwise, not to say foolish decisions. So this sort of research tends to conclude that it's not so much native intelligence as just poverty itself that tends to lead people to make riskier decisions, less thoughtful, less considered decisions, and that having a secure income, well, doesn't guarantee that you'll be wise and sensible. Clearly there are quite stupid people who have large incomes, but gives you the luxury to make choices and decisions based upon long-term planning, careful consideration. It buys you time, I suppose, essentially is what it boils down to, and poverty really doesn't buy you very much time at all, because you're constantly living from hand to mouth and having to make very quick, rapid decisions about how to survive on a day-by-day basis rather than a decade-by-decade basis, which is a luxury purchased by a very large income. So control theory itself predates Hershey. It's been around for a while, and one of the key early figures was Ivan Nye, who advanced this idea that antisocial behaviour, bricking windows, graffitiing walls, shouting at people in the streets, mugging old ladies, that sort of stuff, is an expression of a failure to self-control. And there are a number of factors now argued in self-control which subsequent control theorists have by and large agreed on, sometimes tweaked this a little bit, but by and large agreed on. There are various forms of self-control in existence. Direct means of self-control are essentially authority figures when you're very young, your mother, your father, or whoever it is that happens to be bringing you up when you're very young. And as you get older, that starts to include school teachers. It will include maybe scoutmasters, Girl Guide leaders, the vicar possibly, or imam, or whoever the religious leader in question happens to be. And then it can include moving from there to the police, the courts, the government itself. Authority figures go up and up and up depending on the nature of the deviance we're engaging in and age group and so forth. But those various authority figures can in effect threaten to punish you. Now, whether that's parents threatening to send their children to bed early, or making them sit on the naughty step, or giving them a slap, or whether it is the threat of school exclusion, or perhaps a fine from the magistrate, or a prison sentence from a Crown Court judge, various levels of punishment that can be delivered. It's also worth bearing in mind, of course, that reward and punishment go together. So this tends to focus control theory on more on the punitive side, but you could certainly make the argument that all of those authority figures can also dispense rewards, and therefore rewards incentivize good behaviour as well as punishments discouraging bad behaviour, antisocial behaviour. So part of set of control theory is this idea to look at if somebody has very little self-control. Is it because they have not had very many direct means of reining in their impulses and their more destructive behaviours? Has there not been an effective parent figure or an effective teacher figure or police officer or what have you to wave the finger at them and tell them convincingly that if they don't stop doing such and such a thing, then they will suffer unpleasant consequences? So perhaps the figure hasn't been there, or if they have, their threats seem so wishy-washy or erratically applied that the threats simply weren't convincing. Or it may, of course, also be that the nature of the thing threatened simply wasn't off-putting for the person to whom that threat was directed. So if they were told as a child, oh, well, you go to your room, and perhaps their room there's a TV set and a PlayStation and Lord knows what else up in their room, then that might not have seemed like very much of a threat, perhaps. Indirect means is starting to shade into Freudian theory and build on Freudian theory. That if you learn to identify with the various authority figures in your lives, like the ones I've just mentioned, as you're young and of course as you get older and older, then you admire them, you look up to them, they set good examples, they show you how to behave, what to do in life. And there are a number of sociologists who've highlighted that a potential problem here is that society, like the proverbial Japanese fish, rots from the head. So if you look up to the authority figures in society and they are lying, cheating, backstabbing, behaving appallingly, then they set no example for you to look up to. In fact, the example they set is one that would encourage more antisocial behaviour rather than positive behaviour. So that's an element as well. So either there is no one to look up to, or the figures that are there to look up to are themselves corrupt and therefore not encouraging pro-social behaviour. And that slides into internal means of control, or really it's more like a Venn diagram. These things all overlap with each other. Internal means is when you've taken on board the moral standards set to you by parents, teachers, scoutmasters, the vicar, whoever else, and agreed with them. Or at least they've made, well, it may or may not be a rational agreement. It may be more of an emotive thing with comparatively little rational thought, or it may be a sort of more deeper, rational, philosophical grasp and understanding that, yes, I agree with the moral standard set by my community that it is wrong to steal, it's wrong to beat up frail old ladies and nick their handbags, it's wrong to deal heroin, it's wrong to do this, that, and the other. And so that person effectively polices themselves. And for control theorists such as Ivan and I, that level in the internal means is perhaps the most key feature, because in any society of any great size, possibly different if you live in a tiny little tribe up in the Amazon, but in any society such as the scale of societies we all live in, it's ludicrous to expect the police to be watching every single thing you do and be able to threaten you with punishment at every single turn. It's just not feasible. Therefore, what you need are people to internalise moral standards so they effectively police themselves, which is Freud's argument. The development of the conscience, the superego, is that inner voice that tells you, even when there's no one around watching you, that so-and-so behaviour is not very nice and you shouldn't really do it, or indeed that you really ought to be going and revising for your exams or paying your taxes, even if you would much sooner be sitting in a hammock, sipping gin and reading your favourite novel. Not that that's what I'm doing, of course, at all. So for control theorists of various shapes, forms and sizes, a critical factor in crime, and obviously not all antisocial behaviour is necessarily criminal, it can just be rude and unpleasant without actually being illegal, but whether we're talking the rude and unpleasant end or the full-on criminal end of the market, the root of all of that sort of behaviour is lack of self-control. So the person either is not intimidated by the threats, or they don't believe the authority figures are capable of monitoring their behaviour and catching them when they do unsavoury things, or more critically, they lack that inner moral conscience that says, do not do this behaviour. So lots of us, as Freud noted, frequently have, I say lots of us, practically everybody, let's face it, has impulses. Somebody says something to you and it's rude or offensive or unpleasant in some way, and for a brief second you think about thumping them. Or you walk into a shop full of lots of expensive things you couldn't possibly afford to buy, and for a brief second you think about, wouldn't it be nice just to stick one of these flash goods in my pocket and walk out? But the vast majority of us don't turn around and thump the annoying person or steal the expensive goods from the shop, because we have that inner voice. Now that inner voice may simply say to us, "Ooh, there might be a CCTV camera in this shop, I better not do it," because even if the person behind the counter is looking the other way, the camera might be pointed at me, and so you do it more for fear of you behave yourself more for fear of the consequences. Or we might have the inner conscience voice that says, no, it is wrong to steal. Even if I could get away with it, it's still wrong to do it, and so you don't do it. But clearly not everyone has that inner voice, and not everyone is particularly afraid of the consequences, or they might look round and think, well, that CCTV camera probably isn't even plugged in, I could get away with this, no one would necessarily know, and so they make a rational choice. And rational choice theory is very much part of control theory, and both of these form part of right realism, which is the realistic view of crime from those more on the right wing of politics. We will get to explaining that in more detail as we go along, and the differences between that and left realism. So it's to understand that people make choices. Now, we do this all of the time. Rational choice theory is not specifically a study of crime, it's a study of all human behaviour, to say that we go through life and we are faced with 1,001 choices every single day. And when we are faced with these choices, we weigh up our considerations. If I do A, the consequence might be B. And therefore we decide a cost-benefits analysis. I would like to benefit from so-and-so thing, but it will cost me this consequence. Is the consequence, the cost, worth the benefit? And if I decide that it is, I'm very likely to go and commit the action and do the behaviour. Whereas if I decide, nope, the consequence is not worth the benefit, then I will probably not do it. So to give you a silly non-criminal example, I might look at the cream cake and think, I'd really like to eat that. The benefit of eating that cream cake is me sitting there going om nom 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 as I eat the cream cake and thoroughly enjoy it. What is the cost? Well, the cost could be £1.50 for the cream cake, a financial cost. Or the cost could be that I will put on weight. Or the cost could be that if I had diabetes, for example, there could be health problems resulting from eating a big sugary cake. There's all sorts of potential costs that might be involved. And so I weigh up, can I afford the £1.50? I can, brilliant. I'll go and buy the cake and sit there and go om nom 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 nom. If I can't afford the £1.50, I simply don't have the money on me, I might think about, could I nick the cream cake when no one is looking? And then I'm weighing up the potential costs of nicking a cream cake. What if I get caught? I might get thrown out the shop, banned from ever going back there. I might possibly end up in court. Fairly unlikely for £1.50 cream cake, but you never know. There could be various social consequences. If I were 10 years old, the shopkeeper might go and tell my mother or my father that I've nicked a cream cake, and there could be consequences for that. So it depends on the context, the situation, as to what the possible costs might be. So if I decide that the costs to my weight gain, or the costs to some medical condition I might have that could be worsened by scoffing a cream cake, or the costs to getting caught by nicking the cream cake, because I don't have £1.50 on me, are more than it's worth, more than the pleasure I'd get from scoffing the cake, therefore I won't do it. And the assumption is in rational choice theory that every choice we make is of that kind of a nature, that we and are and we weigh up the pros and cons and make our decisions accordingly. Now, why people make sometimes disastrous choices, well, in rational choice theory, it simply highlights the fact that most of the time we are not fully informed of the consequences. So we are making decisions based upon the information we have available to us at the time, and clearly, very frequently, we don't have all the necessary information available to us at a given time. So the person in the jewellery shop who's eyeing up the CCTV camera and thinking to themselves, I bet that's not plugged in, it could turn out actually it is plugged in, it is recording, it is pointing directly at them and watching them grab the necklace off the counter and leg it out the shop. So they didn't have the full array of information when they made the choice to steal the necklace. And so they end up in court as a result. Had they known the camera was plugged in, would they have still done it? Well, possibly. But equally, a lot of people probably would not have stolen the necklace had they known the camera was definitely plugged in. So poor choices are often down to poor information, or inaccurate information, or incomplete information. We're making decisions on limited information, and therefore it's unhelpful. And sometimes it's down to what you might call the great unknown, that there could be consequences to an action that we simply had never thought of. It never occurred to us that something might happen of the nature that does happen. We guess at the likely consequences, but there are sometimes quite surprising, quite unlikely fluke consequences to behaviours. So as we were running out the shop with the necklace in our pockets, we didn't notice the bus driving towards us, and so we get knocked down by the bus because we were too busy looking over our shoulder at the shop. So we hadn't thought about the likelihood of getting run over by a bus in the act of stealing the necklace. That sort of thing. So there can be totally unplanned, unforeseen consequences to actions that we suffer those consequences, or sometimes could even be a very positive consequence, simply because we hadn't even thought and realised there could be that event as a consequence of our choice. Effectively, returning more focusedly to this area of crime, there is the slightly alarming prospect. I say slightly, I personally think it's quite very alarming, but others might think it's slightly alarming, that all criminal behaviour could therefore be seen in the light of a rational choice. Now, nicking cream cakes from a bakery or an expensive necklace from a jewellery shop is one thing. We can sit there and look at dispassionately at the sort of choices and consequences and so forth involved in acts of petty theft or even larger scale larceny. But what if we apply this same argument to murder? A rational choice. I want £50,000, and I know that when Great Aunt Agnes dies, I will inherit £50,000. So I decide to push her down a flight of stairs and get the inheritance a lot quicker than otherwise I might do. That is a rational choice. And you can see a degree of coldness, clinicalness to the choices involved. And that somebody who shoves Great Aunt Agnes down the flight of stairs, obviously they care more about the money than they do about her. So there is a choice involved. What do I care about here most? My money or the old lady's life? Choices being made about the likelihood of getting caught. Will there be fingerprints? Will there be forensic evidence that might end up with me in prison and so forth? Decisions made about that. It sees murder in a much more clinical light. Now, it's one thing to say shoving an old lady down a flight of stairs to get an inheritance. Again, there is a psychopathic level of coldness about that, but one that is more, shall we say, intelligible, slightly more rationally apprehendable even to people who've never committed murder in their life and hopefully never ever will do. But what if we branch this out into the realm of people who kill for pleasure? Serial killers who enjoy torturing and maiming their victims, sometimes over hours or days or even weeks before they finally bump the poor people off. What if we branch this out into the realm of sex offenders, rapists, paedophiles, so forth? It's effectively arguing that there is a rational process involved in their decisions to commit these really quite horrific, gruesome crimes, which lack the cold calculation of property gain. That they are effectively saying, I really enjoy slicing people up. It's like a hobby. I don't know, what can we call that? A pleasure for them, a warped pleasure, but a pleasure nonetheless. And they weigh that up against the likelihood of them getting caught when they're abducting their victim and torturing them and murdering them and disposing of the body afterwards and so on. We've tended, as a wider society, when it comes to things like films and TV shows that represent these sorts of crimes, and within the realm of psychology and psychiatry, where they have to deal with extreme forms of criminal behaviour, to see these behaviours as compulsive, as driven by deep unconscious forces, urges that the individual finds hard to control. So they're out engaging in very destructive, awful behaviours which they themselves barely understand. Whereas rational choice theory sees it as a lot more cold and clinical, a lot more in control. And returning to this idea of control theory, that child molester, that serial murderer is someone in control of themselves. And whilst it doesn't deny that the nature of the pleasures they gain are perhaps deeply rooted in very unconscious, very in Freudian style urges, that nonetheless the person has enough control over themselves to think on a given occasion, let's say the serial offender is sitting there watching a potential victim. They're sitting on a park bench and they're watching someone in the park thinking, oh, could I abduct this person? Could I torture them or murder them and do horrible, horrible things to them? That whilst they're sitting there planning, they are in enough control of themselves that should a police officer stroll on past, the offender or potential offender will change their mind, get out, walk away, not engage in the crime. So they're not in the grip of some sort of intense insanity that overwhelms them and robs them of self-control. They're not like some kind of a compulsive drinker that can't stop themselves tipping alcohol down their throat. There's a medical condition, Prader-Willi syndrome, which is caused by a form of brain damage, in which the individuals have overwhelming hunger that never abates, no matter how much they eat. And if they can't find food in the fridge, they'll go and get food out of the dustbin. They'll just go and take food, steal food from shops and eat and eat and eat and spew it up and eat some more, because they are unable to control their appetites. People in that situation really are out of control. But rational choice theory is suggesting that when it comes to criminal behaviours, including these very, very extreme criminal behaviours, that there is enough self-control. That potential rapist, potential child molester, potential axe-murderer, whatever they might be, can walk away from a potential victim if they weigh up the costs in terms of getting caught by the police and so on as greater than the thrill they would gain from claiming another victim. And that's quite disturbing if you think about that in any depth, that level of coldness. The element here about all people being potential deviants, that is a very Freudian point of view, that we all have the capacity for gruesome urges, it's just that, or dishonest urges at any rate, it's just that most of us have enough self-control not to nick the cream cake, let alone do anything more heavy duty than stealing cream cakes. What factors come involved in loosening the ties of self-control? Well, Toby suggests that teenagers from dysfunctional backgrounds, and whilst this research is going back to the 1950s, is it necessarily any different today? I would suggest probably not. But if you've got kids with very loose family ties, they don't much like their mum or dad, or possibly they're estranged from them, or one or both parents has either left the family home or died or is in prison or something like that, so they're absent and not able to exert the necessary degree of control over the teenager, or even when that teenager was younger, preteen, to exert the control over them then, so that the teenager is disaffected, disassociated, cut adrift from their family, then they are especially vulnerable, Toby says, to being targeted. Now, back in the 50s, Toby was mostly thinking about being targeted by criminal gangs. It's a sort of not, well, I suppose slightly loosely like the sort of Oliver Twist and Fagin type setup, but also drug dealing gangs, and as we get into the 60s and so on, the concern around mods and rockers, and although the concerns about those subcultures were wildly exaggerated, nonetheless the worries that they'd get involved in groups that would meet up and batter each other and take drugs and sell drugs and engage in all sorts of naughty behaviours. These days we might equally think about terrorist cells that groom potential youngsters to recruit them to join in terrorist groups, or the concerns around sex predators grooming potential victims either online or, as with these cases with the children's homes up north, grooming them in person. So vulnerable, unprotected teenagers who are easy to recruit into crime, or to turn them into victims rather than to turn them into criminals. So Toby's argument from the 1950s is that this sense that the vulnerability of kids is down to loose family ties. And therefore the treatment, the response, what can society do about this, is, for Toby, to strengthen family ties. Now, Toby uses this phrase stakes in conformity, which probably sounded a lot more mainstream in the 1950s than it does these days. Conformity is one of those words that's got a bit of bad press about it. We've all got this sort of slight, well, I say all of us, many people have got this slight teenage rebellion hangover of seeing conformity as being very dull and boring. And what in the 1950s they used to say, oh God, you're such a square. that kind of thing. I have no idea what teenagers say nowadays as an equivalent term, but to conform is seen as boring, whereas for Toby, it's actually a positive thing to become a law-abiding member of society, a civilised person. So if you want to think rather than conformity, you could use a more modern, upbeat, positive word to suggest someone who's pro-social, kind, caring, compassionate, obeys the law, doesn't go around hurting and maiming people, someone who is invested in society, which is fundamentally what Toby is talking about. Someone who wants to participate. And this is still something being flagged up by modern day researchers. Why should youngsters want to support society if they don't feel they can be part of society? And a strong element of that is financial involvement in society. So, for example, we have mentioned in previous lectures arguments had around financial investment in society. Jordan Peterson, who admittedly is a psychologist rather than a sociologist, but the argument pans across, points out that so many young people these days haven't a hope in hell's chance of getting on the property ladder because prices are skyrocketing and wages are stagnating and so forth. They're never going to own their own home. The best they can look to is maybe rental, and even rental, it might be renting a room in a shared house rather than renting their own space. Therefore, why would they want to support the capitalist system or the mainstream system if they feel excluded and isolated from it? Though not so much about family ties, but about ties to wider society. And this is a repeated theme in right realism, that to get people to obey the law and participate in society and pay their taxes and do all the rest of it, they've got to feel invested in society. They've got to feel part of it rather than excluded from it. Now, at this juncture, if we were all sitting in a class together, we might pause and discuss this issue here of, particularly for those of you who are parents or aunts, uncles who've got teenage relatives, what is their stake in society in the 21st century? What makes them want to be involved, and conversely, what alienates them, disaffects them, and leads them not to want to be involved in wider society? And we could start talking and discussing these various dissenting movements, things like the Extinction Rebellion movement, which obviously isn't just teenagers. You get people of all ages involved in that, but quite a lot of kids, far more kids involved in that than in most other forms of dispute. What inspires that involvement? A wish to change society because they see that the future of society, I say they see it, they could be wrong, they could be right in their predictions, who knows, we won't know till we get there, but they are very concerned that there will be no society for them to be involved in 10, 20, 30 years' time. So are they rebelling against it, or are they trying to save it? There's all sorts of discussions we could have on that one. You can have those discussions with each other via social media, and if you want to bounce some ideas around with me, likewise through email or Facebook or what have you, we can do that. Some of the ideas that develop from this are these four factors here: attachment, commitment, involvement, and belief. So attachment, how much of an emotional attachment do we have to other people? So do we care whether we're talking about rebellious teenagers or people of any age group? How much do we actually care about other people? Do we have parents, husband, wife, children, friends, etc., who we care about, and we love them, we want them to love us and like us, and we might indeed have duties and commitments to them. You put in, if it's children, you obviously want to feed them, or a spouse for that matter, you want to pay the rent, so you've got a place to live together and all that sort of thing. So all of the duties and involvements, so it's not just love at the emotional level, but all of the practical expressions of our love for another person. And pets. Actually, that could well extend to your dog, your cat, your goldfish, that you have a duty of care towards them, that might influence your choices. So, for example, somebody might think to themselves, I really hate that person who lives down the road, can't stand them, I'd quite like to go and burn their house down. However, if I got caught and sent to prison for arson, what would happen to my dog? So there'd be no one to feed him, take him for a walk. He'd probably end up being put in kennels or put down or whatever. And so they might restrain themselves from going and setting light to the house of the person they can't stand down the road, because they're worried about what would happen to their dog. So even if they were completely alone in terms of human contact, they've got no spouse, they've got no kids, they've got no relatives left alive they care about, nonetheless they still have an attachment to the dog, and that attachment leads them to restrain their criminal impulses and think, I better not do that because. Commitments, you've got the example there of things we have to lose. So somebody's got a job they like doing, or even if they don't particularly like doing it, they recognise that financially, status-wise, etc., etc., it's a pretty good job. So they think to themselves, well, if I went drunk driving home from the pub, I might lose my licence. If I lost my licence, I would no longer be able to do my job because I couldn't drive to work. Therefore, I will not go drink driving. For somebody else, they might be worried about losing their house, losing their possessions. So these kinds of commitments are not so much to another person, but to things like jobs, houses, possessions, things you might lose if you were caught for a crime and suffered some unpleasant consequence like prison or a hefty fine you can't afford to pay, that kind of thing. Involvement in society, we're out and about. We don't just work. Well, I suppose some people do, people with really boring lives, but the majority of us, we might go to, whether it's down the pub for a drink with friends, to a chess club, knitting circle, church, mosque, synagogue, a cinema club, something or another that you participate in, or charities you volunteer for, or whatever it is you get up to. And the concern is partly, if I commit crime and get caught for it, I would then lose access to those things, but also because those things consume time. We spend time at work, we spend time going around pubs or cinemas or whatever it is with friends, we might spend time going to the really exciting stamp collecting club and talking about stamps, or whatever it is that we do. If you are sitting in the cinema watching a film, well, that's an hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever, out of your life in which you can't be robbing shops, drunk driving, mugging old ladies, or getting up to other naughty things. So the more involvement you have with pro-social activities in life, not only do you have the emotional commitments and investments to them, but simply put, it's less time you have to go and commit other activities. And this concern about disaffected, bored teenagers is that they've got lots of time on their hands. And people who are bored, who are just hanging around with nothing much of anything useful to do, as the old saying goes, the devil finds work for idle hands. Will they get involved in destructive things because their time is not being taken up with constructive things? And whilst the usual focus tends to be on bored teenagers and the need for them to have youth clubs and that sort of stuff, you could have a bored middle-aged person, a bored elderly person, a bored any age group person who is sitting around with very little to do and just dreaming up destructive nonsense to fill their time with. Finally, the belief system, that could well be religion, but it doesn't have to be. You could be an atheist and have a strong ethical code or a political conviction or what have you. Those strong beliefs, again we're getting at the internalised level here, are the kinds of beliefs that discourage you from engaging in criminal activity. Now, that said, there are quite obviously examples of people who appear to have strong beliefs. You certainly expect them to have strong beliefs, but who engage in criminal activities. Now, whether that's the very stereotypical stuff about clergymen molesting choir boys, or people of any devout religious or strong political commitment who nonetheless go and rob the poor box or fiddle the accounts of the local Conservative club or Labour club or whatever it is that they're a member of. There are people who espouse strong social convictions publicly but go and do naughty things privately. Now, is that because they never really believed in it, there was only ever lip service? Or is this notion that intense moral belief prevents criminal activity a naive one? That's a murky area to get into, and an interesting area, and certainly something worth considering. Could even be a potential dissertation topic. ... Why do people of strong convictions nonetheless sometimes do illegal activities? Why has their strong conviction not prevented them from doing an illegal activity? Does it sometimes actually justify them doing an illegal activity? You think these radicalised religious and ideological groups who encourage their members to go out and commit crimes in the name of a religious movement or a political ideology. Actually, it could go, rather than discourage them, it could actively encourage them under certain conditions. Something to think about. So Hershey's image of criminal types as being largely teenagers and people in their early 20s, bored at a loose end, hanging around in gangs, getting up to mischief because they've got nothing useful to do, feeling very disaffected and alienated from wider society. This is kind of building really fundamentally on Durkheim's notions of anomie, and people cut off and estranged from wider society, with very few commitments, very few responsibilities, very few emotional ties or investments, finding their identity by drifting off into gangs and things like that. Doesn't pan out for everyone. Obviously, it does account for a sizable chunk of crime, but there are certainly criminal patterns that it does not account for. I'm assuming a lot of you will recognise the two people in the photograph as Fred and Rose West. For anyone in the class who doesn't remember who Fred and Rose West are, they were a very murderous couple who, between the two of them, abused, molested, battered, tormented their own children, their stepchildren, killed some au pairs, picked up female hitchhikers, took them back to their house, raped them, tortured them, murdered them, and both of them, both Fred and Rose, actively involved in the crime as well. So it wasn't the case that Fred did it all and Rose sat in the corner knitting and looking the other way. They were both very actively involved. Now, the reason I've slapped their ugly mugs in this PowerPoint is because up until they got caught, they had been perceived by their local community as very, very respectable. He ran his own building firm, and she helped out with the secretarial side of it. They were taxpayers, business people, upstanding members of society involved in various social causes. They had not only each other, they had their children as attachment figures, they had their business, they had their home, they had their possessions to which they were attached. They had all of those kinds of things that theoretically should prevent them from committing crimes, but there they were, committing the most horrific crimes over years and years and years, and just succeeding in concealing it from everybody else around them, who had no idea by and large. I suppose some people might have the odd suspicion, but by and large most people had no idea that they were anything other than apparently respectable. And they're not by any sense rare in that way. There are all sorts of people in very respectable walks of life with commitments to jobs, commitments to families, commitments to religious communities, the list goes on and on and on, who nonetheless do horrific things. And eventually get caught for them. Some of them die without ever being caught. Like Jimmy Savile, whose crimes only came fully to light after he was dead. But others, like Fred and Rose West, get caught at some point whilst they're still alive. And it's a shock horror gasp to the people around them who had no idea. So how do we account for people who are fully invested in the system in mainstream society, yet do these appalling things on the side? And it's not just very extreme crimes like this, it also includes more mundane crimes like people who embezzle from their place of work or get involved in charity work and then embezzle from the charities. So they are very social mainstream type people, but they are engaged in rather naughty activities, not as horrendous as the West's, but still criminal activities nonetheless. How do we account for that? Because Hershey's control theory doesn't fully address people of this nature. Now, before we move on to other angles, because control theory is more on the right realist side, I'll touch, as a reminder, on the left realist side, which has its roots in Marx and the conflict theorists that have come after Karl Marx and been influenced by him to greater or lesser extent. Not every single feminist is influenced by Marx, but quite a lot are, quite a sizable proportion are, so Marxists, feminist sociologists and so on. Focus on conflict theory, which is the idea that society is in a state of conflict between rival groups, the haves and the have-nots. So for Marx, that was the haves were the bourgeoisie, the people possessed of ownership of the wealth and the power and the factories and the farms and all of the various sources of making and accruing wealth. They owned the material resources of society, and the have-nots were the proletariats, the downtrodden workers who were wage slaves, as Bakunin described it, just kind of turned up at the farms and the shops and the factories, drudged away and got paid relatively little for their hard toil. So they never really appreciated the benefits of their own labour. For a lot of feminists, that division is not so much between rich and poor as it is between men and women, between men who are seen as having social status and access to various legal protections and so forth, and women who, at least more so in the past than nowadays, but still in quite a number of countries around the world, still very much the case, where women are legally disenfranchised and limited in all sorts of shapes, forms and capacities by the law and the various control mechanisms of society, and are more vulnerable to certain forms of crimes like domestic violence than men are. In the law will do very little in some countries at least, and historically over here tend not to do a great deal to protect women who are victims of domestic violence, where men who become victims of street violence will be offered a degree of protection. It does have to be said that men who get battered, senseless or stabbed or whatever by their wives also don't tend to get a lot of protection, even in very male-dominated societies, because it's seen as a shameful thing to admit to. So domestic violence in either direction doesn't get a lot of attention and support from the authorities in society, in any kind of society, so far at least. Other people have, rather than saying rich and poor or male and female, there are other conflict theorists who have divided it down other lines, like racial lines, for example, between different ethnic groups, this sort of thing. So there's various different ways of envisioning quite where the conflict lines lie, which group is on this side and which group on that side. But whatever the group is, conflict theory essentially sees society as being in a state of conflict between various rival groups competing in at each other's throats, and crime, when this is applied within left realism, is understood as a manifestation of social inequality and conflict. So, for example, property crime is often characterised as the have-nots seizing by illegal means the things that they can't afford or attain to, because society is structured against them ever likely being able to afford and attain those material goods by legitimate routes. Marxist feminists have characterised things like domestic violence as a kind of displacement activity, as Freud would have described it, that the system is so frustrating and demoralising, depressing for male workers that they come home from their hard day labour at the factory or wherever it is, full of rage against the system, which they cannot express because the boss will sack them if they have a go at the boss. And so they displace their aggression onto an easy target, the wife, the children, etc. And it's almost like treating another human being as a punch bag to take out their rages on. And the rage, fundamentally, at least for Marxist feminists, is seen as stemming from the inequalities in the system, and women bearing the brunt and children bearing the brunt of male rage at these inequalities. A lot of other non-Marxist feminists strongly disagree with that interpretation, but just flagging up what these interpretations are, whether or not you agree, disagree with them, is entirely down to you. So is this a fair perception conflict theory? That is society in a state of conflict between rival groups who are at each other's throats, competing for limited resources, and are they turning to crime because either as a route of attaining the material resources they don't know how to get by any other means, or in terms of violence and such like, as an expression of frustration, anger, despair, displacing their rage, whether that is a case of going home and a man beating up his wife, or possibly for that matter a woman going home and beating up her husband, or a frustrated person going and lobbing a brick through a window, slashing car tyres, whatever other kind of violent activity they might displace onto. So the rage is not per se to do with the council who built the bus stop. The rage is stemming from the system. It's just that the poor old bus stop gets smashed to pieces and vandalised because those angry youngsters have nowhere else to vent their rage on. They don't know how to tackle the inequalities in the system, so they go and smash up a bus stop. Makes them feel better for 5 minutes. Is that a fair perception, or is that a rather naive characterization of society? Leave you to think about that one, discuss it, debate it, pause the video if you want to go and and ah about it and drink a coffee, tea, and either bounce your ideas back to each other through your WhatsApp groups and such like things, or if you want to bounce them towards me through email, please do so. Now, if conflict theory, of whichever sort, is correct, can we make predictions which would then test the veracity of conflict theory? So, if conflict theory, we'll go for the Marxist one for the moment, conflict between rich and poor. If it is true, what would we expect in terms of crime patterns, crime rates? Have a think. Pause the video if you want to. And hopefully your answer will be something along the lines of, if Marxism is correct, we would expect to see much higher higher rates of property crime committed by the working classes than by either the middle classes or the upper classes. Because the middle and upper classes are amongst the haves, who do not need to steal property, and the working classes are the have-nots, whose ability to attain material goods is drastically limited. And so you could argue we would expect to see people stealing, robbing houses, shoplifting, etc., goods which they cannot otherwise afford, at much higher rates amongst the poor than amongst the well-off. So we could then go and look at actual crime statistics and see if they match that prediction. If they don't match, then that would start to question the reliability of Marxist theories. So perhaps you could go and do some research, have a look at crime stats online, and I do appreciate you've got most of you kids to look after and relatives to worry about and so on at this current time, so you probably don't have a great deal of time to be sitting there online looking up stats. But if you get 5 minutes spare at some point and you want to go and have a look at various crime stats, see if they match up to the predictions. How does Marxist theory explain, let's say, well-off middle-class accountants who fiddle the books at their firms and embezzle money? How does it explain the super-rich who engage in highly dodgy criminal activity? for material gain. Or indeed for, let's say, sex crimes or crimes of physical violence. If we understand violence as an expression of thwarted anger at the system, are there examples of very wealthy people beating up their families or beating up whoever it is they want to go and beat up, where we would struggle to account for where their anger stems from in terms of being thwarted by the system, when in fact they are actively supported by the system? How would we understand that and explain that? From a feminist point of view, if the conflict is between men and women, what patterns would we predict? Have a think about it, and hopefully your answer would be that the majority of crime would be committed by men, relatively little crime. Well, actually, we could debate that one, couldn't we? Ought we be predicting that women as the oppressed class, if Marxist feminism is correct in characterising women as the oppressed class, would we be predicting that they, as the oppressed class, would be the ones filled with anger and frustration and lashing out, or stealing to attain that which they cannot afford to attain by other means? Or would we be going down the line of more standard Marxist feminist arguments that working class men, frustrated and thwarted by the inequalities of the system, go and take out their rage on their wives and children, and so we'd be looking at patterns of domestic violence being committed primarily by men against women and children? Or are we now in the situation where the same theory is accounting for opposing things? So on the one hand, men are the oppressors, but on the other hand, working class men are the oppressed. And there is some level of contradiction going on here as to quite what we would expect in terms of patterns of violence and patterns of property crime, as to who is committing what crimes. So in effect, we would be arguing that working class men would be committing a lot more domestic violence than middle or upper class men, who are less thwarted or indeed not thwarted at all by the system. But we could also potentially be arguing that women would be committing a great deal of property crime to access the material goods that they cannot afford to access by more straightforward means, because they are financially disadvantaged by the system. So does that follow through? We could look at shoplifting patterns. Would we find way more female shoplifters than male shoplifters? And are they stealing things they can't afford to buy, or are they just stealing all sorts of random things that they could easily afford to buy? We would expect to see higher rates of domestic violence by men than by women, and also that fractured by class. Is that the case? Something for you to go and do a little bit of research on. But we'd also have to, of course, factor in here reporting is a significant issue, because as we are frequently told, the vast majority of people who are victims of domestic violence do not report it. Therefore, reported patterns of domestic violence compared to unreported patterns of domestic violence are potentially significantly different. Do middle class and upper class women who get beaten up by their husbands go and report it as often as working class women do? Or are they discouraged from reporting it? Are men who are beaten up by their wives more or less likely to report the offence than women beaten up by their husbands? And would that go down class lines, or would that be across the board for men regardless of their social class, being much less likely to report incidences of violence committed by their spouses? What about same-sex violence? Gay couples, lesbian couples beating each other up. And there are certainly statistics about that, which show it's actually quite high in many respects. And which is a challenge in itself, because from a feminist point of view, the focus on domestic violence has been primarily in the sense of men battering their wives. If it's a lesbian couple and one partner beats up the other partner, how do we account for that within a feminist context? Therein is a whole other issue. But have a look at when you get time, have a look at the research you can find and reflect on how well it fits in with expected predictions. the throat's starting to go. Brengen's research here gives you an example of some research data. So this was carried out in Montreal, Canada, with 516 Caucasian or white, if you prefer, males who had been assessed by their teachers with so these are school kids as to their aggressive behaviour. Now, this does flag up the issue of how we define aggression, and you can go and look up Brengen's research and find out how that report defined aggression. So are we talking being just gobby and mouthy, or are we talking about chucking chairs across the classroom, or thumping another pupil, or thumping a teacher for that matter? There's different ways of defining aggression that opens up questions in and of itself. They also used a degree of self-reporting behaviour from these 16, 17-year-olds as to not just the teacher saying, oh, they did this, they did that, but also the kids themselves saying, well, I've done this, I've done that, in terms of violent behaviour within the schools. Do we factor in, or ought we to be factoring in, or Brengen to be factoring in, violent behaviour that takes place outside of schools? There's an issue for discussion there. Brengen factors in issues of parental supervision, caregiving. So in other words, let's go back to this argument that loosened family ties, where the parents are not the authority figures that children respect, are a factor in those children, or teenagers, whatever you want to call them, becoming disaffected, becoming stroppy, aggressive, disruptive. So Brengen's argument is partly, at least, that the less parental supervision and the less mutual respect between parents and children there is, the more likely are those youngish lads to engage in stroppy behaviour as they get older. There's a degree of longitudinal study going on here to see how this patterned out over a period of time in the child's life as well. So this is seeming to fit in and support the argument that the more chaotic the family, the more chaotic will the adolescent's behaviour be as a partial consequence of that, which we could understand in a number of contexts, either in the sense that the child is hurt, upset, lashing out because of all those sort of unresolved anger issues, which is a more sort of psychological approach, or we could understand it in the sense that those youngsters who don't think they will get a smack around the ear hole when they're caught behaving badly by their dad or their mum are more likely to go on behaving badly because they don't think there's going to be any punishments or consequences for it when they get home, and so their behaviour gets worse because it's not reined in. The one argument doesn't wholly preclude the other argument, because you can have a sort of a combination of the two elements coming together here. It'd be interesting to find your views. Do you tend to see this kind of thing as more the child comes from a chaotic home and therefore the child is angry about that and they're lashing out, and so the disruptive behaviour is an expression of their inner discontent? Or do you see it as a kind of expression of loose, slack parenting that these lads will get up to no good because they know perfectly well they're not going to suffer any unpleasant consequences from their parents or anyone else as a result of their bad behaviour? Or do you see it as a bit of both? Brengen's research was stronger family... his recommendations for Brengen were stronger family ties, stricter parenting, more consequences for bad behaviour, and just kind of more traditional old-fashioned styles of family unit, essentially, which is a right realist approach and recommendation. Given that some of you in the class are quite young, you might not have any idea who the people in that photograph are. That's The Waltons. It was a TV show from quite a few decades ago about a very old-fashioned family in America who were growing up in the Great Depression in America, but they were the sort of ideal, super loving, affectionate, kind, caring, morally upstanding family with lots and lots and lots of kids. So it's very mom's apple pie type thing. It's actually a very nice TV show. The ideal of that family was that because mum and dad and granddad and grandma were quite strict about behaviour and didn't put up with any nonsense, that the kids were very well behaved most of the time, the odd little bit of naughtiness, but very well behaved most of the time. And when the kids had problems at school or wherever, they would go and talk to mum or dad or granny or granddad because they trusted them, they knew they'd get love and support and affection. So they all grew up to be decent, kind, caring, nice people and good members of the community who looked after their neighbours and generally did the right thing and made for a decent society to live in. Heinrich's research on that score seems to support it, with the finding that those kids who came from very strong families, like the Waltons, were way less likely to end up being caught with knives and guns and various other weapons, whereas those kids from very dysfunctional families were much more likely to end up being caught carrying a weapon, not necessarily using a weapon, but carrying a weapon. So are the right realists correct? If we all came from families like the Waltons, would we see a great drop in the crime rates because most people would be well behaved and decent because they would be raised with strong moral codes, and on the occasions when they might have a temptation to do something naughty, at the back of their minds they'd be thinking, I don't want to upset my mother, or I don't want to get a kick up the backside from my father, therefore I better not go and do that naughty behaviour that I'm tempted to engage in. Or is crime more complicated by that? Not complicated by it, but more complicated than that sort of an argument. So can people from very nice, loving families like this one go off and do minor crimes? Well, we know that does happen. But can they also go off and do horrendous crimes? Something for you to look into and research. Other theorists like Brookmeyer and so on have said they're not disagreeing about the family attachment issue. They are expanding it to say, as well as family attachment, it's also very important to have school attachment. That is to say, for kids to like the schools they go to. And that's primary school, middle school, upper school, university, I'm sure, college, etc. All of that to feel a sense of belonging and value and worth and purpose and all of those sorts of things. We have had, not really over here, I can't think of many examples in this country, but certainly quite a lot of examples in America of school shootings where a current or occasionally a former pupil of a school turns up with guns, knives, baseball bats, other weapons, and sets about attacking, murdering, maiming other students, the teachers, the caretakers, the school dinner ladies, and the rest of it, vent their spleen in an explosion of horrible, violent behaviour. In America it seems to happen with quite depressing regularity. It does happen in other countries too, not just America. It happens in various different countries around the world. Why does it happen? Well, for people like Brookmeyer, part of it at least, is school non-attachment, that kid does not feel part of the school community. They feel like an outsider. They have Durkheim's anomie. They're adrift. They're angry at the school. They don't like the other pupils. They don't like the teachers. They're quite possibly adrift from their own parents as well. It's that sense of disaffection that builds up and builds up and builds up to more and more anger until one day it explodes over. And part of the argument here is that youth particularly is vulnerable to the lack of self-control, because self-control is a factor that builds up with age. The younger you are, the less self-control you have. The older you are, usually, the more self-control you have managed to learn and develop. So you might have a job where you really don't like the people you work with, but you're fairly unlikely to kill them all off from an act of rage. Although that does happen. Obviously there are instances of adults going into their place of work and shooting up the people they work with. But, by and large, the argument here is that teenagers have less self-control than a 30-year-old, a 40-year-old or a 50-year-old. And so when they get into a rage, they're more likely to articulate it through physical actions than somebody who is twice or three times their age. So Brookmeyer's study here, you've got 6,397 youngsters sampled from 125 schools in America to find out acts of aggression, acts of violence committed, and associate that with how strongly they felt about their school. Did they like their school, or did they feel alienated from their school, or just plain old indifferent in the middle to their school? Very, very few felt a positive sense about their school. Most of them ranked themselves as very alienated, very isolated, very cut adrift, hating, resenting the school, not liking the other kids, not liking the teachers, and so forth. The more disaffected they were, the more likely they were to engage in aggressive, destructive behaviour. Not tipping over to the level of shooting people, but nonetheless, the implication here has been that the lower level types of disruptive behaviour could potentially build up to the much more horrific types of murderous behaviour. The other bit that Brookmeyer flags up here is the PTA, the Parent-Teacher Association. How well do the parents support the school? Anyone who's ever been involved in teaching or had kids or whatever, you get some parents who are very supportive of the school. They go to all the PTA meetings, they turn up to the open evenings where the teachers sit and chat about who's doing well and who's doing badly with the parents. And they get their kids to do their homework, and if the kids misbehave in school and the parents get a phone call home saying, oh, little Johnny's been naughty again, then little Johnny will be getting a lot of earache from mum and dad. Whereas you get other parents who, if they get that kind of phone call, will be storming up to the school and threatening to punch the teacher's face in because they see the teacher as the problem, not little Johnny. And they don't turn up to the open days, they don't do much of anything to support, they don't leave the monkeys if little Johnny does his homework or not. Some parents can be quite hostile to school, and that's frequently because they themselves never enjoyed being at school when they were young, and they still have all those unresolved anger issues hanging around now that they're adults with kids of their own at school. So again, what does society do about this? Well, how do you make school a more pleasant environment? How do you make school a more engaging environment so kids like being there? I mean, not every minute of every day, because that's impossible, but generally speaking, that kids mostly find their school environment enjoyable. Even if they don't like the homework, they by and large enjoy being at school. How do you get the parents positively involved with the school so that they're supporting the school and the policies of the school rather than being antagonistic towards the school? So there's various things that the school itself can do, that government can do, that school psychologists can do to try and address these issues of alienation, both alienation of pupils but also alienation of parents of the pupils. They don't talk so much about the alienation of the teachers, but then that's a whole other issue again. So going back to Hershey, this time in cooperation with Gottfredson, in terms of conditions for crime. So what they're looking at are the factors you've got here on the screen. That individuals have an impulsive personality. Now, when you're 2 years old, you have an impulsive personality because you haven't yet learned to control your impulses. When you're 18, or 30 or 50, then some people still haven't much learnt to control their impulses, and so they have quite an impulsive personality. Not necessarily in a criminal way, you could be an impulsive shopper, one of those people who goes out to buy a bottle of milk and comes back with 15 bags worth of crap you don't know what to do with. You could be an impulsive drinker, you could be an impulsive cake eater, an impulsive all sorts of things, because you lack self-control. And so it's difficult for you to rein in your urges. And if it's difficult to rein in your shopping urges, you might also find it quite difficult to rein in other, more criminal, antisocial types of urges. So if you've got someone who's quite impulsive, can't control themselves very well, and you see a withering of social bonds, now that's, again, all the things we've mentioned already, between teenagers and parents, between students in schools, between adults and wider society, people who feel cut adrift, who don't feel they belong, who don't connect for one reason or another. And there is an opportunity. So you've got to have the opportunity. If you live in a situation where you've got no chance of doing anything illegal, then, well, you won't, because you don't have a chance to do it. But if opportunity presents itself to steal stuff, to get into fights, to take or sell drugs, commit sexual offences, all sorts of other things, then for Gottfredson and Hershey, the highly probable result is that that individual will do it. Because whilst many of us might have the impulse, as we were saying earlier, to nick the cream cake or nick the jewellery, most of us have the self-control not to. And part of that self-control is because we have strong social bonds as well as the internalised moral voice. So if you don't have the strong self-control, you don't have the social bonds, you don't have the internalised voice, and there's the opportunity to go and commit crime, you'll probably do it. So Sprott echoed that earlier bit of research of saying an issue in this of reducing violence, reducing crime, strengthening school bonds, so various after-school clubs, activities, all sorts of things that can be done so that by and large, most students like most of their teachers, most students like most of the other students, they generally quite like being at school, they do fun things, nice field trips, this, that and the other. It becomes a positive experience and they can ultimately see a point to their education. And maybe that's more of an issue once you get to teenage years than for the very young, because I've got the teenagers starting to think about what happens after school. Will I go to college, to university? Will I get a job? Will I do this? Will I do that? So if they can see the relevance and significance of their education to their plans post-school, they're much more likely to be engaged. Whereas if they feel that they've got no hope of anything positive coming at the end of it, so what's the point of studying all this rubbish, man? Then they are going to be quite disengaged. Zero tolerance policies, whether in school or, we may well argue, building on top of Sprott in wider society, are key, and that again is quite a significant feature of the right realist movement, to see zero tolerance as a key issue in maintaining social order and discouraging either minor delinquency or full-on crime. We could also add in here that it's important, many schools already do this anyway, most schools in this country already do it, to build bridges between the school and the wider community. So not just school and parents, but school and the local neighbourhood. So that local shopkeepers, people who own takeaways, the little old ladies and little old men down the road, they see the kids at the school as being nice and well-behaved and helpful and this, that and the other. And so the community likes the school, the kids in the school like the wider community. It all builds up from there. Start them young, build it up. Much easier than taking a disaffected adult and trying to root them. We have a bit of a distinction, certainly on the left, between realist and idealist, in that a number of people, including Hershey, have distinguished between what they term left realism and left idealism when it comes to criminology. So the idealism tends to be seen as the grand theories. So Karl Marx, amongst others, came up with these huge, great big grand theories about life, the universe and everything, which are not necessarily terribly practical or easy to measure or evaluate or monitor the success of how effective these theories are at improving society. So rather than getting bogged down in all of that, it's trying to get a more realist approach to say, what can we do to make crime rates lower, improve people's general experience of society, etc., without getting into all these grandiose theories. So whilst Marx says the cause of crime is capitalism itself, let us tear down capitalism and replace it with something better. Communism, Marxism, etc. Left realists, rather than the left idealists, have given up those big arguments and say let's just focus on the day-to-day stuff of people's ordinary lives and what we can do there. Largely the argument being, which is also an argument made by right realists, is that criminologists, there aren't many of them, are employed by universities, by governments, by various think tanks and what have you, to tackle issues of crime and reduce crime. They are not employed at reasonably large wage packets to tear down capitalism itself, which is a very wordy way of saying do the job you're paid for, don't get bogged down in waving placards and banners and calling for the overhaul of society as we know it, because frankly you ain't going to get that. So be practical. It also, the left focus tends to be more focused on the victims, the right focus, the right realist tends to be more focused on the criminal. So slight differences in emphasis about the victim-focused policies like the witness protection program, things like that, to focus on who becomes the victims of different types of crime. Are there obvious patterns there that certain sorts of people are more likely to be victims of crime than other sorts of people? What changes can be made in the criminal justice system to support victims, enable them to give evidence, make the whole experience less traumatic, etc., etc., etc. Whereas the right realist tends to focus on policies impacting the criminal more than policies impacting the victims. So building on this left-right bit, we've got people like John Lee and Jock Young, who look at subcultures and gang cultures and how they rub each other up the wrong way and conflict with each other. So it's building on that kind of left-wing perception. It's not quite the full-on Marxist proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. Rather, it's seeing how different subcultures, small-scale stuff, in other words, how they clash with each other. So how this local gang clashes with that local gang, which could be gangs of drug users, drug dealers. It could be gangs involved in theft. It could be gangs just involved in disruptive delinquency, bashing each other up, that sort of stuff. And also how those gangs conflict with wider mainstream society. So it's left-wing ideas, but on a smaller scale, of collective conflicts between different groups of people, and focus on how social exclusion is a key issue in that. So people feeling marginalised, excluded from society, and kicking back at the society they feel excluded from through criminal and delinquent activity. And they talk about relative poverty, which is also an issue of key importance to the right. And you might notice I've now mentioned a couple of things that are key to both sides. And it's often the case with a lot of this, especially if you're watching, let's say, debates, whether you're watching them live or watching them recorded via YouTube and that sort of thing. Between those on the right and the left, they get very shouty and they're waving their handbags at each other, and it's all very polarised. But when you strip away the screaming and the shouting, a lot of the issues they are looking at are the same issues, and a lot of the things they are suggesting are often the same suggestions. So there is commonality between the left and the right. There's distinctions too, but there is commonality, which for some of us is a sign of hope that if they could all stop screaming and shouting and waving their placards at each other, then we might actually find a way forward. So, absolute poverty. We've mentioned this in previous lectures, the distinction between absolute and relative poverty. But just in case you've forgotten, we'll recap. Absolute poverty, you might remember a few lectures ago when we were all in class together, I showed you a photograph of a group of very young children ferreting their way through a rubbish dump, a huge great pile of rubbish, and there's these little kids trying to dig anything useful they can find out of the rubbish dump. That is absolute poverty. When someone exists in such a state that they don't know if they're going to eat today. They've got so little to their name, probably just the clothes they stand up in. Maybe not a roof over their head, there's no income, they are hungry, cold, wet, living day to day, quite likely to die of hypothermia or starvation or disease at any time. That is absolute poverty. In this country, in Britain in the 21st century, it's almost unheard of. Go back to the Victorian age, we had plenty of absolute poverty in the Victorian age. Many parts of the world still have absolute poverty. Relative poverty, you might remember that photograph I showed you. There was a scruffy rundown neighbourhood and there's a group of people sitting outdoors on this manky looking old sofa. The dad was, well, if he was the dad, whoever he was anyway, was on his laptop, and the others were sitting there looking bored and what have you. Relative poverty is when you're eating, you've got a roof over your head, maybe not a very nice roof, maybe the food you're eating isn't the best food going, but it's food nonetheless. You've got clothes on your back that might be unfashionable and in need of repair, but you do have clothes on your back. But you look at other people who live on the other side of town and they have much nicer things than you do. So you're not in absolute poverty, you're not rooting through rubbish heaps for something to eat. You are fed, you're watered, you're housed, you're clothed. If you need medical assistance, in this country at least, you can go to the NHS and get medical aid. So you've got that. But there are other people who live on the other part of town who've got flash cars, designer label clothing. You've got some clunky old mobile phone. They've got the latest model phone that costs 3 arms and a leg. So whatever you've got, they've got the same thing, only 10 times better. And so relative poverty is when you feel poor because other people around you have so much more than you do. And that makes you envious. Both the left and the right focus on relative poverty as a driver of crime rather than absolute poverty as a driver of crime. So in other words, it's the envy, the jealousy. You see what other people have got, you want it, you can't afford it, so you go and nick it. Or you start dealing drugs to make the money to go and buy it. You engage in that kind of crime. Arguably inspired by relative poverty rather than absolute poverty. They also look at issues like globalization. So these big companies who have outsourced their customer service to Bangalore or somewhere or other. So you keep getting phone calls from people in foreign countries asking you if you need double glazing or whatever on earth it is that they're selling. So the people who used to do those jobs in this country are now, well, either they're on the dole queue or they've managed to find themselves a different job. But they were discarded by their employer because the wages were, well, probably not very good wages, but those employers could find people to do it for even less money in some other country. They outsourced, they globalised. And so globalisation often means that people who used to be in a job in this country are now out of jobs or being paid so little because the employer has managed to ship in someone who'll do it for half the price, that the financial deprivation is setting in. Job loss spreads poverty, relative poverty in this case rather than absolute poverty, but it spreads it. The more poverty you have, the more likely people are to turn to crime. So the focus here on the left is that crime is chiefly driven by poverty, relative poverty, and mainly we're looking at property crime, people who can't afford stuff, stealing, taking from those who either have plenty or from shop owners who, well, they don't, if you steal from them, the shop owner will end up in poverty, but the perception is that they're taking from those who don't have, taking from those who do have, is the perception of crime. The right realist movement tends to see it in terms of social chaos, the things we've been mentioning mostly for the lecture so far. Breakdown in family, breakdown in schools, breakdown in local neighbourhoods, disaffected youngsters turning into disaffected adults who engage in destruction because they don't give a toss and they're kicking out against the world around them, and lack self-control. They lack authority figures to give them a stern talking to if they misbehave themselves. And so the arguments put forward by people like Wilson and Herrnstein are around the need for tougher prison sentences, tougher regulations in schools and in families. Well, when I say tougher regulations in families, they are against government undermining the authority of parents by criminalising them for disciplining their children, which these days tends to mean smacking, but could in some countries mean other things as well. So, in other words, stricter parents, stricter schools, stricter laws in the country as a whole to enforce control on people who currently lack self-control. And also the arguments around social involvement and commitment. If you're busy at work, you're busy socialising, you don't have time to commit crime. So encouraging people to be in work so that it takes up their time. But also it gives them a commitment. They don't want to lose their job by getting caught committing a crime. Encouraging people to be involved in their communities, hobbies, churches, mosques, this, that, the other, so that, again, their time is accounted for, but also they then have an emotional commitment to those activities, and they won't want to risk losing them by getting caught committing some sort of a crime. The concern there on the right around taxation also overlaps into this issue of poverty, but from a slightly different angle, in that they're saying if you work very hard and lose half your wage packet in taxes, well, you are then going to be facing relative poverty, and it's going to have the same problems that the people on the left are arguing about relative poverty. So their argument is not necessarily to pay higher wages, but to lower the taxes, so you get to keep more of the wage you're being paid already, and therefore improve your financial circumstances. So it's slightly different ways of tackling what is essentially the same issue. So again, quick recap, on the left-hand side, relative poverty is the issue. And how should relative poverty be addressed? Well, on the left wing, the encouragement is government investment. Taxpayers' money to invest in communities, make the communities nicer. And we're going back to that theory about growing up in the broken windows neighbourhood. If you live in an environment that looks rough and ropey and people are urinating in the underpasses and graffitiing the walls, it's a very unpleasant environment to grow up in. You've got very little investment in it. Therefore, if governments put more money towards looking after their communities, people will take better care of their communities. If government put more money into youth clubs, to libraries, to this, that and the other, people will have investments and involvements in those things. Merton's argument around the media dangling, or at least certainly the advertising industry through the outlet of the media, newspapers, magazines, TV, etc., dangling expensive lifestyles in front of everyone's noses that they can't afford, emphasises relative poverty. You might have been quite happy not having seen those adverts, but when you see the adverts of the stuff you can't afford, it then makes you envious and feel inadequate, and so you start thinking about ways and means of making money, which might be just dreaming about a lottery win, or working extra hard or getting a better paying job, or it might be turning to crime to bridge the gap. And so the argument there, the response is to close the gap between the well-off and the less well-off by lifting the less well-off up so that they are closer to the well-off. So instead of one person having 5 billion in the bank and somebody else having 5 quid in the bank, that you're bringing them closer together. So you give more money to the person with 5 quid in the bank, usually acquiring it by taxing the person with 5 billion in the bank. So it's a redistribution of wealth to close the gap. And therefore, in theory at least, reducing the degree of resentment generated by, well, I can't afford this, I can't afford that. You'd have more people who then could afford the things that they are seeing. And social oppression is the other big factor on the left. People who, because of their race, their sex, their social class, their religion, their whatever the factor happens to be, that they belong to a community that is marginalised. And the perception here is that there are definitely marginalised communities. People on the right will argue that one. But on the left, the statement, oh well, you're a woman, therefore you're marginalised, you're a black person, or an Asian person, or a disabled person, or a gay person, or a whatever person, therefore you are marginalised because the majority of people in that group are marginalised and excluded and oppressed, and so that creates conflict between rival groups, between the groups who are mainstream and the groups who are marginalised. That can lead to violent conflict between the groups. It can lead to resentment between the groups. It can lead to stigmatising between the groups, and things like property crime as a kind of a lashing out from people in Group A to people in Group B. And so the solution becomes greater equality, trying to make the marginalised groups more centred in the mainstream, changing laws, positive discrimination to employ more people from marginalised groups, and all of that sort of thing. The right realists tend to take slightly different approaches to these issues. So, as we've said quite a few times already, the notion that a lot of people are very impulsive, and whilst we all have darker urges, most of us know how to control it, but some people don't. And so the response to that is to try and increase social controls. How do they do that? Well, their perception is that it can be achieved by strengthening laws, by enabling authority figures like teachers and parents to have greater control by it, so reducing those laws that interfere with the control that teachers and parents and so forth can influence over their children, their pupils, and anybody else within their sphere of influence, to try and teach those people how to have better self-control by making the authority figures more admirable, more likeable and stronger. That when they say no, they mean no. The lack of consequences in wider society is frequently cited as problematic, of people doing all sorts of dodgy things and never getting their comeuppance for it, whether that's stroppy teenagers or adults or whoever. And so the response is to increase consequences, and that can be things like longer prison sentences, larger fines in court cases, but also enabling teachers, enabling parents, enabling other authority figures like police officers to be able to impose severer consequences for bad behaviour. And it includes things like increasing the number of police officers on the street, which I do appreciate is very ironic given that we have seen cutbacks in the number of police officers instituted by right-wing governments, in this country at least, of late. But generally speaking, this is not specific to British right-wing politics, it's more right realism across the world that they tend to favour. Build more prisons, have more police officers, increase the consequences in the forms of social control. The secrecy disinterest issue is that you get some people who engage in criminal behaviours because they know they're not being watched. They know they can get away with it, that no one notices what they've done in the first place, there's no one around to see, or if there is anyone around to see, they don't care. They're not interested, so they'll just turn a blind eye, look the other way, and allow the antisocial behaviour or outright criminal behaviour to continue and get worse. So again, you can do what you want, you can lower your self-controls because either no one knows, or if they do know, they don't care. And so the response is to increase monitoring. And that can be things, for example, like increasing surveillance powers of the police. This is an idea from Foucault, obviously. When it comes to things like internet pornography, so if you've got paedophiles uploading, downloading child pornography pictures, that sort of thing, the need to have greater controls in place by the companies that run social media so they can detect what's going on, report it to the relevant authorities, and those individuals can be dealt with. But also to make people more socially aware, and this is the policing by consent argument, that in any society there are relatively few police officers. That's just the way of things. And so police tend to work well when the public get involved and become de facto police officers. So the police can't respond to a crime if no one has reported the crime. So it's down to the general public to pick up the phone and say, look, I've just seen this crime take place. That's the greater monitoring. Getting people more involved to feel that they can, which could be things like the Witness Protection Act if people are fearful of reporting crime. So do people feel safe to report crime? Do they feel there is a point in reporting crime? In other words, if you've reported a crime and nothing happens, are you likely to report a second, a third, a fourth crime? Or will you sit there thinking, what's the point, no one cares? So it's, again, increasing the powers of the police, the courts and so forth to respond to crime so that people, the general public, think it is worth reporting incidences when they see incidences. And creating a culture in which there is a sense of, this is our community, we're all going to look after our community, and if you over there, you're going to cause crime and mayhem and disruption, we will tackle you by whatever the appropriate methods are, rather than just sort of looking the other way and hoping the magic fairies will come along and somehow address the crime, because they don't. And again, you'll see there's quite a lot of, as I just said earlier, quite a lot of overlap between right and left on these issues. They're just coming at it from somewhat different angles and getting quite often rather aerated about the different angles they come from. So the left tend to centre things in large-scale social movements, the collective. The right tend to centre things on the individual and individual responsibility and taking ownership of your own behaviour rather than just going, oh, I can't help it, I was oppressed. That's not seen as a get-out argument by those on the right, but by those on the left it's often the sense that we are not quite so much individuals as we are members of larger communities and groups. We have to understand society as an interaction between large-scale communities and groups, more than as an interaction between individuals. Nearly there. Before my throat dries up entirely. So a few other aspects to consider. Murray, back in the 90s, flagged up the concern that around single-parent families and absentee fathers and so forth, that the lack of male role model, particularly in families that were financially strapped, perhaps as a result of lacking a father figure bringing in a decent income, were more likely to experience these lowered forms of self-control in the children, less likely to form positive attachments to societies, and therefore Murray's response was, well, what can society do to support and enable fathers and stigmatise deadbeat dads, but also encourage good fathers and praise good fathers and get them, enable men to be more involved in their families, lower anything that can be done to lower and discourage divorce rates, help strained couples stay together through marriage guidance, counselling or what have you, to lower the number of families that ultimately break up. Murray also goes on to flag up the concerns around the welfare state, and this is something that a lot of people on the right in America, and in this country for that matter, flag up as a significant concern. One of the concerns is that does the state, by providing welfare at various different levels and for various different issues, enable families to break up who otherwise might deal with their problems, get through them and stay together? Or is it a necessary good, which people on the left tend to say it is a necessary good, so that if, let's say, a family is breaking up because of violence or something like that, whereas maybe a few decades ago you would have got couples staying together and enduring the violence because otherwise they would be in dire poverty and homeless and so forth. Nowadays the woman, or potentially the man, is safer to leave the violence and set up separately because they will get financial aid from the state. So is that financial aid enabling people to escape dire situations, or is it making it too easy for people to give up at the first minor problem and think, oh, well, never mind, the state will support me? So the people on the right realist position tend to think one thing, and people on the left realist position tend to think the other. Other arguments around finances and the state, and you get this from, for example, political exponents like Candace Owens and various other people, who argue that the state needs to encourage people to be independent as much as possible, rather than reliant. And it's kind of an echo of that old quote that used to be very popular, possibly still is popular, in Oxfam posters, which run along the lines of, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day; give a man a fishing rod, he will feed himself for a lifetime. So the aim of people more on the right, like not everyone, but some of them, people like Candace Owens and so on, is to suggest that people need to be supported towards independence, where they no longer need financial aid from the state. They can have self-respect, they can go off, earn their own money, do what they like with their own money, not be accountable to anyone else, have their freedom, their independence, their opportunities to better themselves in the future, better self-esteem, etc., etc., etc. Whereas someone who is always in a position of dependence is unlikely to feel any of those things, and therefore, if you can possibly avoid having people in a position of continued long-term dependence, that's a good thing. And those policies, approaches that enable people towards independence where it is possible are desirable policies. And I don't think either side is necessarily arguing that absolutely every single person on the planet can be helped towards independence, because there will be people with such severe issues in their life, health problems, that sort of thing, that they will need an awful lot of care. But the argument is they are relatively few people, at least that's the right-wing argument, that there are relatively few people in that situation, and more people could be helped towards independence, whereas the left-wing argument tends to see more sizable numbers of people who have long-term struggles and therefore will need long-term help. Going back to Jock Young again, who we mentioned earlier, similar ideas to Murray, but not specifically focusing it on male role models. For Young, it includes female role models as well. That the critical issue is that an awful lot of people lack positive authority figures to look to, which could be, as we mentioned earlier, that one or both parents have died, or they're absent for one of a dozen different reasons. It could be including authority figures in the sense of teachers, youth club leaders, scout and guide leaders, religious leaders, political leaders, celebrities that people might look up to. There's a whole raft of individuals that get looked up to. Are those figures positive ones? And if they are, society is so much the better. But Young says either they are tending to be negative figures, celebrities who just behave abysmally. That includes not just celebrities in the sense of actors and pop stars, but that includes members of the royal family, it includes politicians, it includes a whole raft of other people in the public eye, some of whom behave very well and others of whom behave appallingly. If there's more appalling figures than positive figures, Young sees that as part of the problem. And if they're not appalling, maybe sometimes they're just absent entirely and not there. So more positive figures that the younger generations can model themselves upon, for Young and for Murray, are critical in improving society. And Young picks up on this square of crime. He says those four factors there, the police, potential offenders, potential victims, and the general public, are all interrelated. We can't say the responsibility for resolving crime exists entirely on the police and the courts, because it's an interaction between all four of these forces working together. So there is, as mentioned earlier, the public have to pick up the phone and report offences if they've seen them taking place. Or a victim of a crime might need to report the crime. if it's taken place, get in contact with the social agencies or seek help from another member of the public to tackle the offender. The offender needs to understand the impact they've had on the victim, which is reparative justice. Some offenders wouldn't give a monkey's what effect they've had on the victim, but other offenders might buck their ideas up when they realise the severity of the impact they've had on their victim. So there's all these interactions between these different forces which either help limit crime or, if they're not working well together, help enable crime. Other critiques we can offer is that so far we've talked about left realism and right realism. Virtually nobody talks about centre realism and tries to bring these forces together and look at the common grounds. It's all either one side or the other, and as we mentioned earlier, lots of shouting and hollering going on between different sides. Is there a centre ground here that needs to be focused on and developed? I would argue personally, yes. Because as has been said several times in the lectures already, there are marked areas of commonality and issues and approaches that are actually agreed upon between these two supposedly opposing sides. It's also worth noting that neither the left nor the right gives much attention to addressing crimes of the middle and upper classes. They're focused on this idea of relative poverty being a significant factor in crime, driving crime and frustration, driving crimes of violence. And that frustration being caused by relative poverty, being caused by social alienation and marginalisation and the rest of it. But there are people who have a ton of money, who are not marginalised, who are not oppressed, who are not suffering any of those relative poverty-induced issues, who nonetheless embezzle, steal, cheat, assault, rape, engage in appalling activities. I dare say you can think of quite a few people in the news of late who come from very well-off, very well-to-do backgrounds who have engaged in terrible behaviours, and none of the theories we've bounced around so far account for them. If they lack self-control, and certainly a lot of them appear to lack self-control, it's not because they're brought up in marginalised, poverty-stricken environments where they're alienated from their communities and all the rest of it. We could turn outside the realms of sociology to somebody like Erich Fromm, who was a psychologist, who was very interested in the kinds of abuses of power that he grew up through in Europe with the Nazis and other extremist political movements, where he flagged up that adult narcissists, and he spoke about this idea of malignant narcissists, self-indulgent egomaniacs. He pointed out and emphasised that a lot of these people become self-indulgent, egomaniacal, abusive adults because throughout their life, from a young age upwards, they've often had parents, teachers, individuals around them who have enabled them, who have let them off the hook, who have let them get away with things again and again and again, who have tidied up the chaos they've caused so they've never had to face much consequences for their action, if any consequence at all. And now as adults they continue to be surrounded by yes men and yes women who, whatever crazy lunatic thing they want to get up to, they are enabled to get up to it with very little repercussion for them. So Fromm was, although a psychologist, seeing a strong community involvement here, so it starts to shade into sociology in a sense, that it's not just that individual who is disturbed, it's the whole community around them who help them to continue to be disturbed and get away with greater and greater levels of abusiveness, to the point where they do feel they can indulge in all sorts of horrible antisocial behaviour, whether that's stealing millions of pounds to add to their already enormous bank accounts from pension funds, or whether that is demanding grotesque sexual services in exchange for giving actresses a job in a film, or whatever other thing it might be that they're getting up to. They do it not because they're poor and impoverished, but because they can get away with it. And so we're back to this argument about the lack of consequences. But here the lack of consequences, we could say, is caused by having too much status, too much uncontrolled ability to do as you please, rather than being put upon and downtrodden and oppressed and alienated through poverty. It's almost alienated through wealth, through an excess, if anything, because they can do as they damn well please, and so they do as they damn well please. We might well argue, is it possible for either the left or the right to come up with a solution and an explanation for all crime? Or are we being naive in expecting that? Maybe we've got to accept that some crimes are explained by some theories and other crimes are explained by other theories, and some crimes can be addressed by certain methods taken by society, and other crimes need to be addressed by other methods taken by society. That a left-wing argument or a right-wing argument doesn't solve everything, and therefore we do need to move out of this either-or spat and start to think of a bigger picture and a broader picture, and not being nailed down to having to operate our ideas in one little box. Which brings me, thankfully for my throat, towards the end of this PowerPoint. Now next week it will be another online one because of a 3-week shutdown that the Prime Minister has ordered, and that takes us into the Easter holidays. After the Easter holidays, well, none of us know. Let's keep our fingers crossed that some cure will have been found for coronavirus by then, and things will be getting back to normal. Hopefully so, because it would be nice to see you before the end of term. But we'll play this one by ear. So next week, another virtual lecture. We'll get into symbolic interactionism, George Mead and various people who came after him, and their views on deviance, and look at another criminal case study of another crime, another criminal I should say, and there'll be some assignment support for your teaching materials assignment. Now, we are discussing at the college issues around hand-in deadlines and all that sort of thing, about what does need to be extended and what doesn't. So if there is an extension to be offered for that one, I will let you know, but please don't assume at this stage there is going to be an extension. So if you can continue working towards the deadline that's already there, then it will be a nice bonus for you if I send you all an email saying that extensions have been made. But assume the current date at the moment until you hear otherwise. Send me your questions. You can do that through email, through Facebook if you want to join up with my work Facebook profile, or you can append, if you go onto the YouTube page that this video is uploaded through, you can append comments there, and there's various bits on Brightspace where we can bounce comments back and forth to each other, as well as all you students talking to one another as well as talking to me. And I know you do that anyway through things like the WhatsApp, whatever it's called, that thing anyway. So do please keep in touch with each other as well as with me. Thank you.